The dining hall at Camp Pendleton buzzed with its usual evening energy. Hundreds of Marines moved through the serving lines, their conversations mixing with the clatter of trays and the steady hum of industrial kitchen equipment. The smell of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables filled the air as another day of rigorous training came to an end. Private First Class Jake Morrison grabbed his tray and scanned the crowded mess hall for an empty seat. At 19, Jake carried himself with the confidence that came from completing boot camp just 6 months earlier. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his jaw set with the determination that had carried him through every challenge the Corps had thrown his way. Jake had grown up in a small town in Nebraska, where his father worked construction and his mother taught elementary school. He had always dreamed of serving his country, inspired by stories his grandfather told about World War II. When he finally enlisted, Jake threw himself into military life with everything he had. He followed orders without question, pushed himself harder than anyone asked, and took pride in being a Marine. As he walked between the long tables filled with his fellow service members, Jake noticed the usual mix of ranks and personalities that made up their unit. There were the seasoned sergeants who had seen multiple deployments, the corporals who served as squad leaders, and the newer privates like himself, who were still learning the ropes of military life. The conversation at most tables centered around the upcoming field exercise scheduled for the following week. Everyone knew it would be challenging, involving 3 days and nights in the California desert with minimal supplies and maximum stress. The exercise was designed to test everything they had learned about combat tactics, survival skills, and teamwork under pressure. Jake finally spotted an open seat at a table near the back of the mess hall. As he made his way over, balancing his tray carefully, he noticed a figure approaching the same area from the opposite direction. The person wore what appeared to be civilian clothes rather than a military uniform, which struck Jake as odd for the dining facility. The individual was a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and an athletic build that suggested she stayed in excellent physical condition. She moved with a confident stride that commanded attention, though she seemed to be trying to blend in with the crowd around her. Jake assumed she must be a civilian contractor, or perhaps someone visiting the base on official business. It was not uncommon for civilians to eat in the mess hall when they were working on base projects or conducting meetings with military personnel. However, something about her presence seemed different, though Jake could not quite put his finger on what it was. As both Jake and the woman approached the same area, their paths intersected near a particularly crowded section of tables. Jake was focused on finding his seat and not spilling his food when he accidentally bumped into her, causing her to step backward slightly. Without thinking, Jake reacted instinctively. In his mind, she was just a civilian who had gotten in the way of a Marine trying to find his seat. His training had taught him that Marines always had priority in their own facilities, and he felt justified in asserting that priority. "Watch where you're going," Jake said firmly, giving her a slight push with his free hand. "This is a Marine mess hall. Military personnel have right-of-way here." The woman looked at him with an expression that seemed to mix surprise with something Jake could not quite identify. Rather than respond with anger or indignation, she simply stepped aside and allowed him to pass. Her reaction seemed almost amused, as if she found his behavior interesting rather than offensive. Jake continued to his seat, satisfied that he had handled the situation appropriately. In his view, he had simply reminded a civilian about proper protocol in a military facility. He sat down and began eating his dinner, joining the conversation at his table about weekend plans and the upcoming field exercise. The woman, meanwhile, continued toward a different section of the mess hall. Jake noticed that she seemed to know exactly where she was going, moving through the facility with the kind of familiarity that suggested she had been there many times before. This struck him as slightly odd for a civilian, but he dismissed the thought and focused on his meal. As Jake ate, he could not help but notice that the woman had taken a seat at a table with several senior non-commissioned officers. They seemed to be treating her with considerable respect, standing when she approached and engaging in what appeared to be serious conversation. Jake found this behavior puzzling, wondering what kind of civilian contractor would command such deference from experienced Marines. The mess hall continued its normal rhythm around them, with service members coming and going as they finished their meals and headed to evening activities. Some would return to their barracks to write letters home or catch up on personal tasks, while others had duty assignments that would keep them busy well into the night. Jake finished his dinner and prepared to leave, gathering his tray and utensils for the trip to the dishwashing station. As he stood up, he glanced once more in the direction of the woman he had encountered earlier. She was still deep in conversation with the senior Marines at her table, and something about the scene continued to puzzle him. Walking toward the exit, Jake passed close enough to the woman's table to overhear fragments of their conversation. They were discussing tactical scenarios and equipment specifications with a level of detail that seemed far beyond what any civilian contractor would need to know. The woman spoke with authority about military procedures and protocols, demonstrating knowledge that typically came only from extensive military experience. Jake paused for just a moment, close enough to hear her discussing the upcoming field exercise with insights that surprised him. She seemed to know details about the training objectives and evaluation criteria that were typically shared only with the Marines who would be participating in the exercise. Despite his curiosity, Jake continued toward the exit, still convinced that the woman must be some kind of specialized civilian contractor with extensive military knowledge. It never occurred to him that there might be another explanation for her familiarity with Marine Corps procedures and her apparent authority among the senior enlisted personnel. As he dropped off his tray and headed toward the exit, Jake felt satisfied with how he had handled the earlier incident. In his mind, he had simply maintained proper protocol and ensured that military personnel received appropriate priority in their own facility. He had no idea that his assumption about the woman's status was completely wrong. The evening air outside the mess hall was cool and pleasant, with the California sun beginning to set behind the mountains in the distance. Jake walked back toward his barracks, thinking about the training schedule for the following day and the upcoming field exercise that everyone was discussing. Other Marines moved along the sidewalks around him, some heading to additional training sessions, others returning to their quarters for the evening. The base maintained its steady rhythm of activity, with personnel constantly moving between different facilities and assignments as they carried out their duties. Jake reached his barracks and began preparing for the next day. Laying out his uniform and checking his equipment, he spent some time reviewing training materials and discussing the upcoming exercise with his roommates, all of whom shared his excitement about the challenging scenarios they would face. As the evening progressed, Jake occasionally found his thoughts returning to the incident in the mess hall. Something about the woman's reaction had seemed unusual, though he could not quite identify what had struck him as different. Most civilians would have been more upset about being pushed, yet she had seemed almost entertained by his behavior. Still, Jake remained convinced that he had acted appropriately. Military facilities were designed to serve military personnel, and it was important to maintain proper order and precedence. He fell asleep that night, confident that he had done the right thing, completely unaware that the following day would bring revelations that would completely change his understanding of what had happened. The next morning arrived with the sharp blast of reveille echoing across Camp Pendleton. Jake Morrison rolled out of his bunk with practiced efficiency, his body responding automatically to the familiar wake-up call. The barracks filled with the sounds of Marines, beginning another day of training and duty, their movements quick and purposeful as they prepared for morning formation. Jake went through his usual morning routine, shaving carefully and ensuring his uniform met the exacting standards expected of every Marine. His boots gleamed from the previous night's polishing, and every piece of his equipment was positioned exactly where regulations required. These details mattered enormously in military life, where attention to small things often determined success or failure in much larger endeavors. Morning formation took place in the company area, where nearly 200 Marines assembled in perfect rows facing their company commander. The California sun was already warm despite the early hour, promising another day of intense heat that would make training even more challenging than usual. Company Commander Captain Sarah Rodriguez stood before the assembled Marines, her presence commanding immediate attention and respect. Captain Rodriguez had earned her position through years of exemplary service, including 2 combat deployments and numerous commendations for leadership under pressure. She was known throughout the unit for her fairness, her tactical expertise, and her unwavering commitment to the welfare of the Marines under her command. "Good morning, Marines," Captain Rodriguez called out, her voice carrying easily across the formation. "Good morning, ma'am," came the thunderous response from 200 voices speaking in unison. Captain Rodriguez began her morning announcements, covering the day's training schedule, administrative requirements, and reminders about upcoming events. Jake listened carefully, knowing that missing important information during formation often led to problems later in the day. "Today we will begin intensive preparation for next week's field exercise," the captain announced. "This training is designed to test everything you have learned about small unit tactics, survival skills, and leadership under stress. The scenarios will be realistic and challenging, designed to push you beyond your comfort zones and prepare you for the demands of combat operations." She continued with specific details about equipment requirements, safety protocols, and performance standards. Jake felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with challenging training exercises. These opportunities to test his skills and push his limits were among the reasons he had joined the Marines in the first place. Additionally, Captain Rodriguez said, "We will be joined today by a special observer who will be evaluating our training procedures and providing recommendations for improvement. This observer has extensive experience in combat operations and tactical training, and I expect you to conduct yourselves with the professionalism and excellence that defines this unit." Jake wondered who this observer might be. Sometimes, civilian experts or personnel from other military branches visited to observe training exercises and share their expertise. These visits were generally beneficial, providing fresh perspectives on tactics and procedures, while allowing Marines to demonstrate their capabilities to outside evaluators. After formation, the Marines dispersed to their various training assignments for the day. Jake's platoon was scheduled to spend the morning working on squad-level tactics in the field training area, followed by afternoon sessions on equipment maintenance and combat first aid. The field training area was located several miles from the main base facilities, reached by a convoy of military vehicles that transported the Marines and their equipment to the designated training sites. Jake enjoyed these trips, which provided opportunities to see more of the sprawling military installation and sometimes catch glimpses of other units conducting their own training exercises. Upon arrival at the training area, the Marines quickly unloaded their equipment and organized into their assigned squads. Each squad consisted of 13 Marines, led by a squad leader, typically a sergeant or corporal, with several years of experience and at least one combat deployment. Jake's squad leader was Sergeant Michael Torres, a tough but fair leader who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and earned widespread respect for his tactical knowledge and concern for his Marines. Sergeant Torres had a reputation for demanding excellence, while ensuring that every Marine in his squad received the training and support needed to succeed. "Listen up," Sergeant Torres called to his assembled squad. "Today, we're working on movement techniques in urban environments. These skills could save your life in combat. So I want your complete attention and maximum effort. We'll be practicing room clearing, building searches, and coordination between fire teams in complex terrain." The training began with a review of basic principles, followed by progressively more complex scenarios that required the Marines to work together as a coordinated team. Jake threw himself into the exercises with characteristic intensity, determined to master every technique and exceed every standard. As the morning progressed, Jake noticed a figure observing their training from a position near the command post. The observer wore military fatigues rather than civilian clothes, though from his distance Jake could not make out specific details about rank or unit identification. The presence of an observer added an extra element of pressure to the training, as everyone wanted to make a good impression and demonstrate their proficiency. During a brief break between exercises, Jake had the opportunity to get a closer look at the observer. To his surprise, he realized it was the same woman he had encountered in the mess hall the previous evening. Today, however, she wore a complete military uniform that immediately answered several questions while raising many others. The uniform was unmistakably that of a United States Marine, complete with all the proper insignia and equipment. What caught Jake's attention immediately, however, was the rank insignia visible on her collar. Even from a distance, he could see that she wore the silver oak leaves that identified her as a lieutenant colonel, a senior field-grade officer with significant command authority. Jake felt a cold shock of recognition wash over him as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. The woman he had pushed in the mess hall, the person he had dismissed as a civilian contractor, was actually a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps. Not only did she outrank every Marine in his unit, She outranked virtually everyone on the entire base except for the commanding general and his immediate staff. The reality of his mistake hit Jake like a physical blow. He had not only been disrespectful to a senior officer, he had actually put his hands on a lieutenant colonel and spoken to her in a manner that could easily be interpreted as insubordination or worse. In the military justice system, such behavior could result in serious disciplinary action, including reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, or even court-martial proceedings. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process the full scope of his error. Lieutenant colonels typically commanded battalions of 800 to 1,200 Marines, making them among the most senior operational commanders in the Corps. They were responsible for complex training programs, combat operations, and the welfare of hundreds of personnel under their command. As Jake watched, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes moved among the different training stations with the confident bearing of someone thoroughly comfortable in military environments. She observed each exercise carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions of the squad leaders and platoon commanders overseeing the training. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had earned her rank through nearly 20 years of distinguished service that included multiple combat deployments, advanced military education, and a series of increasingly responsible command and staff positions. She held a master's degree in military studies and had graduated from several prestigious professional military education programs. Her current assignment involved evaluating training programs across multiple Marine Corps installations, identifying best practices and areas for improvement in preparation for future combat operations. This work required extensive travel and observation of units at all levels, from individual Marines to large-scale combined arms exercises. Jake realized that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had probably been conducting similar evaluations for years, visiting dozens of military installations and observing thousands of Marines in training. Her familiarity with the base and her apparent comfort in military dining facilities now made perfect sense, as did the deference shown by the senior non-commissioned officers who had been speaking with her. As the training continued, Jake found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the tactical exercises. His mind kept returning to the previous evening's incident and the potential consequences of his actions. He wondered whether Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had recognized him and whether she planned to take any official action regarding his behavior. The worst part was that Jake had no one to blame but himself. His assumptions about the woman's status had been based on nothing more than the fact that she was wearing civilian clothes in the dining facility. He had failed to consider any alternative explanations for her presence, jumping immediately to conclusions that supported his own preconceived notions about who belonged where in military facilities. During the lunch break, Jake considered approaching Lieutenant Colonel Hayes directly to apologize for his behavior. But he realized that such an action might only make the situation worse. Drawing additional attention to the incident could potentially escalate what might otherwise be overlooked as a minor misunderstanding between personnel who did not know each other. Instead, Jake decided to discuss the situation with Sergeant Torres, hoping that his squad leader might provide guidance on how to handle the delicate situation. Sergeant Torres had extensive experience dealing with various military protocols and might know the best way to address the potential problem before it became an official issue. Jake approached his squad leader during a quiet moment between training exercises, when they had a few minutes to speak privately without being overheard by other Marines or the visiting observer. "Sergeant Torres, I need to ask you about something," Jake began, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anxiety he was feeling. "What's on your mind, Morrison?" Sergeant Torres replied. His attention focused on Jake, with the kind of concentration that experienced leaders gave to Marines who approached them with serious concerns. "Last night in the mess hall, I had an incident with someone I thought was a civilian contractor," Jake explained carefully. "It turns out, that person was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the observer who's here today. I was disrespectful, and I pushed her slightly when I thought she was in my way." Sergeant Torres's expression grew serious as he processed the implications of what Jake had just told him. The sergeant had been in the Marine Corps long enough to understand exactly how serious such an incident could become if it were handled improperly or if it reached the attention of higher command authorities. Sergeant Torres studied Jake's face for several long moments before responding. The experienced squad leader had seen many situations during his military career, but few carried the potential consequences of a junior Marine having physically confronted a senior officer, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the incident. "Morrison, You realize what you're telling me, right? Sergeant Torres asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. You put your hands on a lieutenant colonel. That's not something that gets swept under the rug in the Marine Corps. Jake nodded miserably, feeling the full impact of his mistake settling over him like a heavy weight. I know, Sergeant. I thought she was a civilian contractor who was getting in the way. I had no idea she was military, let alone a senior officer. Sergeant Torres glanced toward where Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was observing another squad's training exercise, then back to Jake. The thing is, Morrison, intent doesn't always matter in situations like this. What matters is what actually happened, and how it gets reported up the chain of command. The afternoon training sessions continued around them as other Marines practiced their tactical movements and weapons handling. Jake found it surreal that normal military life was proceeding while he faced what could potentially be a career-ending situation just days after completing his first 6 months as a Marine. What should I do, Sergeant? Jake asked, hoping that his squad leader's experience might provide a path forward that could minimize the damage from his mistake. First, you need to understand that this might already be out of our hands, Sergeant Torres replied. If Lieutenant Colonel Hayes decides to report this incident, it will go straight to the company commander and probably up to battalion level. At that point, it becomes an official investigation with formal procedures and potential disciplinary action. Jake felt his stomach drop as he contemplated the possibility of facing court-martial proceedings or administrative punishment that could result in his discharge from the Marine Corps. All his dreams of military service, all the pride he had felt in earning the title Marine, could disappear because of a few seconds of poor judgment in a dining facility. However, Sergeant Torres continued, there might be another way to handle this, depending on what kind of person Lieutenant Colonel Hayes turns out to be. Some senior officers appreciate it when junior personnel take responsibility for their mistakes and try to make things right. As they spoke, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes finished her observation of the other squad and began walking in their direction. Jake felt his heart rate increase dramatically as he realized he might be about to face the consequences of his actions much sooner than he had expected. Morrison, Sergeant Torres said quickly, if she approaches us, you follow my lead and let me handle the initial conversation. Don't volunteer any information, but be prepared to take full responsibility if she brings up last night. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes reached their position and greeted Sergeant Torres with the professional courtesy that characterized interactions between senior officers and experienced non-commissioned officers. Sergeant Torres, how is your squad's performance today? Outstanding, ma'am, Sergeant Torres replied. The Marines are demonstrating excellent tactical proficiency and teamwork. Private First Class Morrison here has been particularly focused on mastering the urban warfare techniques we've been practicing. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes turned her attention to Jake, studying him with the kind of careful assessment that senior officers used when evaluating personnel. Jake stood at rigid attention, trying to maintain his composure, while wondering whether she had recognized him from the previous evening. Private First Class Morrison, she said, tell me what you've learned from today's training exercises. Jake struggled to organize his thoughts while standing before someone whose rank commanded enormous respect throughout the military hierarchy. Ma'am, the training has reinforced the importance of communication and coordination when operating in complex environments. Each Marine has to trust his teammates while maintaining awareness of the overall tactical situation. That's an excellent observation, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes replied. Trust and communication are indeed fundamental to military operations at every level. They're also important in all aspects of military life, not just combat situations. Something in her tone suggested that she was referring to more than just tactical training, though Jake could not be certain whether she was alluding to the previous evening's incident or simply making a general point about military service. Sergeant Torres, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes continued, I'd like to speak with Private First Class Morrison privately for a few minutes. If that's acceptable. Of course, ma'am, Sergeant Torres replied, though Jake could see concern in his squad leader's eyes as he stepped away to give them privacy for their conversation. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes gestured for Jake to walk with her toward a position where they could speak without being overheard by the other Marines. Jake's mind raced through possible scenarios for how this conversation might unfold, none of which seemed likely to end well for his military career. Private First Class Morrison, she began once they were alone. "I believe we encountered each other last evening in the dining facility." Jake's throat felt dry as he realized that she had indeed recognized him and remembered the incident. "Yes, ma'am. We did. Would you like to tell me about that encounter from your perspective?" she asked. Her tone neutral, but clearly expecting an honest and complete response. Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could determine the entire future course of his military service. "Ma'am, I made a serious error in judgment. I assumed you were a civilian contractor, and I was disrespectful. I pushed you when I thought you were in the way of military personnel. I was completely wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes listened without interrupting, allowing Jake to complete his explanation before responding. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex personnel situations. "Private First Class Morrison, do you understand the seriousness of what occurred? You physically contacted a senior officer while displaying disrespectful behavior. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, such actions could result in charges of assault on a commissioned officer and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." "Yes, ma'am, I understand," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as he contemplated the full implications of what she was describing. "However," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes continued, "I'm also aware that you were operating under false assumptions about my status. Your behavior, while inappropriate, was not motivated by deliberate disrespect toward military authority." Jake remained silent, uncertain whether she was indicating that the situation might be resolved without formal disciplinary action, or simply explaining the factors that would be considered in determining his punishment. "I've been observing your training performance today," she said. "Your squad leader speaks highly of your dedication and improvement since joining this unit. Your fellow Marines respect you, and you appear to take your responsibilities seriously." "Thank you, ma'am," Jake managed to say, though he was still unsure about the direction their conversation was taking. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes paused for a moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully before continuing. "Private First Class Morrison, I'm going to offer you a choice. This incident can be handled through official channels, which would likely result in formal disciplinary action that could affect your entire military career. Alternatively, I'm willing to consider this a learning experience, provided you demonstrate that you've truly understood the lessons it offers." Jake felt a surge of relief, mixed with continued anxiety, as he realized she might be offering him an opportunity to avoid the most serious consequences of his mistake. "Ma'am, what would that involve?" "First, you will write a detailed analysis of what happened, why it happened, and what you've learned from the experience. This analysis will address the importance of not making assumptions about people based on limited information, the significance of showing respect to all individuals regardless of their perceived status, and the potential consequences when military personnel fail to maintain appropriate standards of conduct." Jake nodded eagerly, grateful for any opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of the situation and his commitment to avoiding similar mistakes in the future. "Second," she continued, "you will present this analysis to your entire platoon during a formal presentation, explaining the incident and the lessons you've learned. This will serve both as acknowledgement of your error and as education for other Marines who might face similar situations." The prospect of admitting his mistake to his fellow Marines was embarrassing, but Jake recognized that it was far preferable to facing court-martial proceedings or administrative separation from the Marine Corps. "Finally," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, "you will serve as my assistant during the remainder of my evaluation visit to this base. This will give you the opportunity to observe how senior officers conduct themselves and to better understand the responsibilities that come with military leadership." Jake was surprised by this final requirement, which seemed to offer genuine opportunity for learning and growth rather than simply punishment for his mistake. "Ma'am, I would be honored to serve as your assistant." "Very well, then," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes concluded. "Report to the base headquarters at 0700 tomorrow morning. Bring your analysis, and be prepared to begin learning about leadership at levels beyond your current experience." As they walked back toward where Sergeant Torres and the rest of the squad were continuing their training, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. He had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of making assumptions and the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity. That evening, Jake spent hours working on his analysis, carefully considering every aspect of the incident and its implications. He wrote about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, the need to show respect for all individuals, and the potential consequences when military personnel fail to maintain appropriate standards of conduct. The following weeks proved to be among the most educational of Jake's young military career. Working as Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's assistant provided him with insights into leadership, decision-making, and the complex responsibilities of senior military personnel. He observed how she interacted with Marines at all levels, always treating them with dignity while maintaining the standards necessary for effective military operations. When Jake finally presented his analysis to his platoon, he spoke honestly about his mistake and the lessons he had learned. His fellow Marines listened respectfully, many of them recognizing that they too had made assumptions about people based on limited information. Years later, as Jake advanced through the ranks and eventually became a leader himself, he would often reflect on that incident in the mess hall and the officer who had chosen education over punishment. The experience had taught him not only about avoiding assumptions, but about the kind of leader he wanted to become. Someone who recognized that even serious mistakes could become opportunities for growth and learning when handled with wisdom and compassion.